anywhere. You name it, we can live there. We can live under the ocean. We can live off the planet if we want, right? However, strip off the tech. Now, and what happens? Yeah, it starts, we can't live in the water anymore. We can't live in space. Now we're relegated to the land. Can we live in all the land? No. A lot of it is not habitable because of temperature, water, etc. So it starts to shrink up considerably, right? So the idea would be fundamentally we can live all over, but it's not like you just say, okay, I'm done today, and I'm going to be in Paris tonight. Yeah, maybe, but I'm not walking there or anything, right? So we typically live in a much smaller space than the overall where we could potentially live. So for the majority of you, it's this place right here in the middle. What's that? That's IV, right? And IV is the world's richest slum. I should have never been a professor. I should have been IV slum or landlord, right? Charge you guys, like, what does it cost for an apartment on DP? What is it? About 1,000 for one room? And is that you need to share that room, right? Crazy, it's like 1,000 per person. So it's just nuts when you think about the rental fees for a place like that. However, it's not like you walk out of this door and you just walk down and you go across the street and say, okay, I'm in IV, and you just walk into any apartment you want, you sit down. You start eating food, you sleep in a bed. If you did that, you'd probably end up in jail, correct? Maybe that happens on a Friday night, I don't know. Right? Where you're at, you pick a place. I had a roommate who was like that, just wander around and grab someplace. Must know him, I guess, I don't know. So anyway, that's not the case. So it's even smaller, the unit of which you actually occupy, and it's like this little tiny hovel in DP that you're getting charged ridiculous amounts of money for, right? So that would be your realized niche, where you actually exist. The fundamental niche is where you can potentially exist. Does that make sense? So that's the difference between a realized and a fundamental niche. All right, so here's the thing. We talked about this idea of competitive exclusion. Does competitive exclusion occur in natural population? Now think about it. What was the definition again? No two individuals or species can exist in the same niche, or one or the other will go extinct if it overlaps completely. So if my resource bubble overlaps with yours completely, one or the other is going to go extinct. That's the idea. No two species can occupy the same ecological niche simultaneously, or one or the other is going to go extinct. All right? So how would that work in reality? So I want you to think through it yourself. If we had a completely shared niche, so this would be if you had a complete competitor. Every time you went to the refrigerator to grab a piece of food or a drink, what would happen? Your competitor would be there and go for exactly the same thing. Every time you went to sit down in the seat, what would happen? They would be sitting there too. Every time you wanted to go to the bathroom, what would happen? They would be right there. And every time you wanted to mate, what would happen? They would be right there. How long would that last?
Not long.
Not very long, right? Probably 30 seconds for me, right? That every person's throat that would be. So you can't do it. It's just too intense of an interaction. So the thing is, well, if that's what the exclusion principle is teaching us, and the Lacan-Volterra basically predicts that, and we can get matches to that, why is it not happening all over the world? So does it occur? Well, here's an example using particular kinds of wasps. Now, these are parasitic wasps. These are called aphytes. And so this is a kind of neat example of competition in action. So here's the wasp. In the middle, there's two species of it, same genus. In the middle is a pest. It's called the red scale. And it's a pest of citrus. It's like a parasite. And so what it does is it grabs hold of the citrus, it bores through the skin of the citrus, and then rends the flesh. So this thing actually invaded the California coastline and then spread like wildfire into the mid parts of the Central Valley. So remember I talked about California used to be a rich state? So at one point, California used to be one of the richest agricultural states in the entire world. We still produce a tremendous amount of food, but not nearly what we used to. And one of the most preferred crops at the time was citrus. And so we shipped citrus out all over the world. This thing attacked citrus. The problem was a mass chunk of the California economy was based on citrus production. And now you have something that can destroy it. So there was a panic that was going to collapse the economy. So how do you get rid of it? So they tried to use pesticides on it and all kinds of stuff like that. And it wasn't very effective because this thing kind of burrows into the flesh. So they figured, well, is there a way to control it biologically? and they found a wasp that preys on it from its own habitat, okay? And so what they do is they brought the wasp over to see if it would control the pest, which in lab experiments did a very good job of doing. So they decided to release the wasp. So the first wasp was released in the 1900s, and it was Chrysophylla. And it was introduced from the Mediterranean area of the world, and it was introduced here. Well, obviously, Mediterranean climate, like Greece and Italy, it's a lot like it is right here. They're almost identical. If you go to Italy, certain areas, it feels identical to being in Southern California, okay? So it did very well. The pest did well, and so did the wasp. So what it did was it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It's what I've been telling you about all these invasions that failed, right? This one actually worked. It did a really great job of killing off this red scale. It parasitized it. What it does is it lays eggs on it. The larvae consume the red scale pest. So it did a great job, and it really controlled the population density of the pest to the point at which its numbers were no longer a threat to the production of citrus in California. Okay? All right. They saw another wave, another rise in the population of the pest that occurred right in the late 40s. And so they said, well, it worked so great the first time, let's do it again. So they went and they got another wasp. But they didn't get the same wasp. Why, I don't know, but they got a different one, okay? And this one was Ligonensis, and it came from South China. And so what it did was basically, it was introduced to the same places and took over and rolled across the state. It did a great job on the red scale again, but as a side set of its interaction, it eliminated all the resident populations of Chrysophylla and outcompeted them and drove them to extinction. So that is a good example of what principle? The competitive exclusion principle. They were direct competitors for one particular resource, this pest, and for the same space to occupy, and it wiped the original wasp out. There was another wave that happened 10 years later. This thing typically hits in 10-wave cycles, all right? So at this point they said, well, it worked great, let's do it again. Again, didn't get the same wasp. They got a different wasp. And this one came from India. And this one was really interesting. They introduced it in the same places, but what happened was it rolled across the interior valley of California, the Central Coast, where we have all this massive agricultural production. But when it got to the coastal mountains, it stopped dead. And didn't advance any further. And then the middle one, the Ligonensis, was found all along the coastline and existed, and continues to exist today. So what happened was, one fills up the Central Valley, Malinus, the other one fills along the coastline. Why didn't it just eradicate it, just like the first one, the second one did to the first?
They have different niches.
What's that? It's not a geographic barrier. They can get over the mountain ranges. What is it?
They have different niches.
They have different niches. So the niche here, the difference is, think about where they come from, okay? So in this case, the Mediterranean climate of the first one was actually similar from the climate from South China. So they both came from a very similar climate. But the third one and the second one come from very different places. The Indian variety comes from a very dry habitat in India, which is similar to where in California?
Inland?
The Central Valley. But the coastline of California is what in terms of moisture? It's much wetter, which is just like the South China habitat. So what happens is the Central Valley is fine for it, but the coastline is too wet, and that gives the second one an advantage, a competitive advantage. So did competitive exclusion occur? No, only partially, because now they coexist because of geographic differences, right? And the differences environmentally in those different areas. So it doesn't happen all the time. We have an example where it did, an example where it didn't, even within the same genus of organisms, all right? So competitive exclusion in the first case, not in the second. So why is it then that it doesn't occur all over the place? Think about it. If competitive exclusion was the norm, would the world be a diverse place? It means you'd have one dominant predator someplace, one dominant competitor, and a dominant herbivore, and that'd be about it. But the world doesn't look that way. And the reason it doesn't look that way is because of these three main reasons, okay? These are places where competitive exclusion does not take place, all right? The first is, lots of environments are relatively unstable. Rivers are nice examples of this, right? So at parts of the year they're pretty stable, the water seems to be pretty mellow, but then you get rains and it can have these big flooding events. So what does this do here? What it means is that populations never get high enough to do what?
Reach the carrying capacity.
To reach the carrying capacity and eradicate each other. So what happens is before you can ever get big enough to make the resources super limiting and eradicate it, you're reset to lower levels because the environment is constantly resetting you. So low density of organisms means that the resources aren't limited. You won't drive anybody to extinction if that's the case. The other one is where species don't compete. There are lots of environments where species have figured out ways via adaptation to basically coexist through space and time. A nice example is in the Serengeti Plains. So when I look at I have the giraffe, I got the zebra, I got the gazelle right there. They all eat what? They all eat plants, and you might think, well, why the hell? There's 90 of them out there in terms of the number of species of herbivorous organisms that are large in the plains. But they all coexist with each other, they're not driving each other to extinction. Well, they all eat plants. How the hell do they do it?
Different plants?
Because they eat different plants, and they also do what with the plants that they're eating? Look at their sizes. They're eating them where?
Different
At
heights?
different heights. So what they're doing is they're taking a resource and partitioning it into pieces so that they can share effectively. So where does the zebra feed? Right up on the top. And where does the zebra feed? Kind of in the middle. And where does the impala feed? Down at the bottom. So they're segregating the resource vertically. And it's a very effective way to do it. They can feed at different heights, but it's not easy. You ever seen a giraffe try and feed low? They'll do it if they're starving, right? If there's something really delicious they want down. But how, you ever seen a zebra try to feed low? They do this weird thing, you probably done yourself, if you've ever been hurt, you can't bend your knees, right? It's like, my knees are all jacked up from sports, so it's hard for me to kind of get up once I'm down. So they do this weird thing where they get their legs and they spread them out like this, and then they go down to eat it. But what's the problem if you do that?
You're vulnerable?
You are vulnerable to predation, and a lion will jump on your back, right? Because you basically now go vulnerable. These other animals, same difference. If I try to get up, that makes me vulnerable too. Because if I get off my 4 feet and I only got 2, then I'm vulnerable to attack again. So they kind of stay put. So that's a way to share a resource, right? Well, they're not competing because they're partitioning it. And then the last one is an environment that flip-flops back and forth from one condition to another. So a nice example is actually like a river again, but in this case, an Amazon River. So the Amazon River, twice a year, basically floods. Okay? So what happens is when it floods, the water breaches levees and goes laterally across the floodplains and turns the terrestrial forest into a flooded forest. Very different habitats. Half the year is dry, half the year is wet. So what happens is if I'm a great competitor when it's a terrestrial landscape, before I can ever drive anything to extinction, what happens?
It changes.
It changes from a terrestrial environment to a wet one. What do you think? All the things that made me good as a competitor when it was dry now make me what when it's wet? Bad. And so what happens is it knocks my numbers back and I can't outcompete anybody. And then before I get driven completely to extinction, it flips again. And now it's dry again and I do really well. So what happens is that fluctuation in the environment creates winners and losers back and forth, and that ends up balancing itself out, and you don't drive anything to extinction. And little permutations of this all around the world allow species to coexist with each other. With number 2 being very common, which is the separation of resources by partitioning. All right. So, I want to transition. So if I can't see anything.
I just get fun. All the time. Dude, I'm just no, I got a ride
Now let's start talking about predation. So, predation is simple in concept. I eat you, I'm the predator. I eat you or eat a piece of you. So consumptive effects are the norm, right? However, there are more to the impacts of predators than simply consuming the prey, because predators can also influence the behavior of prey. Predation, by definition, is a plus-minus relationship. If predators doing well, the prey obviously not so well. Predators can reduce prey abundance, they can also shift the distribution of organisms. So, for instance, hungry lion comes in the door. I think we gave this example before, right? So what are your options behaviorally to deal with it? I can sit there, and then I can get consumed. I prefer that's not a good option, right? But it happens. What are your behavioral options besides just passively sitting there?
You can hide.
You can hide, that might be a good option. You can also do what? You can run away, and you can do what?
Fight.
You can fight. We talked about all the ramifications of what that might mean. So, when we think about predation, it comes in a variety of forms. And so, there are basically these 5 basic types of predation. There's carnivory, which we think of as the most common, like this wolf eating what's left of that elk. We've talked about this one, parasitism. This one here is a parasitoid, the one with the larva on the outside of the caterpillar. The only difference between a parasite and a parasitoid is parasitoids kill their host as part of their life cycle. And then parasites typically do not. Cannibalism is a very common form of carnivory. And then the most common form of all is herbivory, which is literally a form of predation. Okay? So these are all different forms of predation. You know, it's funny, I tell this story in the big lecture hall when I teach in winter. But you see the example of cannibalism up there as a predation effect? So it's kind of funny. One of the things we realize, I've been talking kind of a lot about communication skills, right, as a scientist, and our lack of ability to communicate with the general population. Sometimes you forget that even within our own kind of groupings, yes? And so when I was first developing this course way back when, I wanted a really nice example of cannibalism. So I was just like flipping around on Google Image or something like that, and I found this great picture that was shot like in the 1900s of some Aboriginal tribesmen who had conquered their foe and was now eating him, right? It was just a great example of cannibalistic tribes. It was like this guy chewing on somebody's leg. I thought, perfect example, from up it goes. And so I go to Campbell Hall, and I pop this slide up, or some version of this slide at the time, and all of a sudden the whole room is like dead quiet. And if you've ever been in Campbell, Campbell's never dead quiet, because there's like 1,000 people in there. It's impossible. There's always rustling or chirping or whatever going on. You know? And it was dead silent, and I'm like, what the hell is going on, right? And I'm thinking, I've never heard this room silent ever. And I turned around and I realized why the room's silent, because well, on my laptop, that image was like this, like a postage stamp, right? But in Campbell Hall, how big was it? It was like 12 by 12 in gory detail, high definition, right? And I look at that and I'm thinking, maybe offensive. Right? And it was kind of funny, and at that point, when I see something like that, I usually make a joke about it, which is probably the wrong thing to do. And I remember saying, oh, don't worry about it, it's just a TA on a bad day. And that just made the whole situation even worse. And so, but here's the funny thing about it. So I don't use it anymore because it ended up being just kind of like a shock value thing. But I still, the scientist part of me goes, screw that, it's a perfect example, put it back up, all right? So it's kind of a hard thing between what you're communicating versus the kind of imagery you're showing. And sometimes you have to realize that. Like if I showed that in a room full of non-biology majors, what kind of response would it get? People would be freaking out, right? Running out the door. Why'd you show that? Blah, 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 blah. I think nothing of it. Like, here's a classic example. When you were little kids, how many of you salted snails to see what would happen? Raise your hands high if you did that. Hands high. I want to see it. Quite a few people did that, all right? So what does that mean? If you were to ask me to do that definition, it either makes you a biologist or a serial killer, right? Those are kind of your options when you do that. But that's actually your first experiment as a studying biologist. What did you prove at that point when you salted snail? If you did that, you ran your first experiment. What did you do? You changed the osmotic balance, and you pulled the water out of the snail and dehydrated it because you just found, you looked at osmotic differences. There it is, right? It's kind of gross and it's cruel, but you did it. If I ask that same question, if I go over to the Communication 101 and ask that question, there's not a single hand that goes up. And if I say that, they look at me like I am a serial killer, and that's what I did by my profession. Right? It's kind of interesting, the differences between the scientific background and other fields that they have. All right, so the question then becomes, what role do predators have in driving the dynamics of their prey? And so again, this is tricky, even more tricky than competition. So my expertise is in predator-prey relationships, and it's really difficult to figure out what's going on. I can eat you, I can scare you, you can fight me, you can run away from me. The combinations of those things can happen. So I don't have an intuitive feel for what's going to happen. So what tool do I rely on? The math again, which will give me predictive outcomes. So I'm going to present a model, which is the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model. Now, like any mathematical construct, it has a series of assumptions that are associated with it. Just to backtrack real quick, the competition model I gave you, what was the growth kernel of that model? Meaning, what was the core of that model that we started with? Before we added the competition coefficient, what was it? It was the logistic growth model, which means that it assumes everything that the logistic growth model did. Constant environment, limitation of resources, no competition, you know what I'm saying? All the same assumptions for that model held. Well, the same thing for this, okay? So we're going to start out with the simplest model that we know, which is this one. What is that model?
Exponential.
That is the exponential growth model, and that's going to be the growth kernel. All the assumptions of this model then will be put into the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model. So basically what it's saying is this, again, change in population size or the change in time is a function of the per capita rate of growth times the population size. But I want to find out what the impact of predators are, right? Now typically what you see is, the more predators you have, the bigger impact I'm going to have. The more prey I have, the easier it is to find them, so I typically have a big impact too. All right, however, when I'm a predator, just being around the prey isn't good enough. I need to catch them. So in order to catch them, I need to have some kind of efficiency of attack and capture. So this is referred to as the attack efficiency. How long does it take me to find you, figure out your prey, attack you, and grab you and then consume you? All right? All that is the attack efficiency. The better I am at it, the quicker I grab you, the quicker I turn your biomass into my own, and the quicker I produce offspring because of it. So that is this particular function right here. The consumption rate of the prey is a function of C, which is the attack efficiency, how fast I can grab you, hunt you down, number of predators, and the number of prey. So let's put it all together. So the entire model is the change in the population size of the prey over time is a function of the per capita growth rate of the prey times the population size of the prey minus the attack efficiency times the predators times the prey size, which is the consumption rate. Why is it a minus? Because the predators are going to do what to the population growth of the prey? They're going to reduce them. Okay, that's what it's basically saying. So that's how we would measure the prey population growth rates in the presence of the predator. Now we need to flip it. So how do we do it for the predator? Well, we're going to use this model again. Again, it's the exponential model, but notice I have a minus in front of it. So I'm not looking at an increase in the population growth rate, I'm looking at what?
Decrease.
A decrease in the population growth rate. Why is that? If there are no prey around, what will happen to the predators? They'll die because they'll starve to death. And so what happens is their population growth decline will increase. So the idea is, in this case, it's dp over dt, the change in the population size of the predator over the change in time is a function of the mortality rate of the predator times the population size of the predator. Well, what's going to counteract that? If there's prey around, I'll eat them and I won't starve. So what's that going to do to my rate of decline? It'll make it less. That's exactly right. The more efficient I am at grabbing the prey and converting it quickly into my own biomass, that will decrease the population decline even more. All right? So, we have the rate of prey consumption. We've already talked about that. But now I need to know how good am I at once I grab the prey up here, how fast can I convert it into myself and turn it into reproductive output? That is the conversion efficiency, G. All right? Let's put it all together. So in this case, I have the change in the population size of the predator over the change in time is a function at my conversion efficiency times the capture rate, which is the prey consumption rate, minus the mortality rate. Okay? That's what it is. This is plus. Why? Every time I catch the prey and convert it, that's a good thing for my population growth rates. This is how I'm decaying over time, and that's why it's a negative. All right. So there we have it. We have both models. Next time we meet, we're going to show how to use this model